Indigenous Peoples and Aging Special Interest Group, and it's also supported by the Mentoring Effect Grant, which is a special project of the GSA Innovative Fund. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on GSA's website, and also a notice to all attendees will be distributed once the recording is available. So if you miss anything, you can always go back and there'll be a link to review this webinar again. There's also going to be a Q&A or a question and answer session which will immediately follow this live presentation, and we will be accepting questions throughout the through the questions feature which is accessible on the right hand side of your screen. So if you have questions, you can send it to us, and then we'll answer them toward the end of this presentation. On to slide 2. Okay, so again, my name is Sarah Yanke. I'm a moderator for today's program along with Dr. Jordan Lewis, who is an assistant professor at the University of Washington's School of Social Work and also the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute. And we are pleased to be a part of this important program. So without further ado, I will hand over the microphone to Dr. Lewis. And we have a quick audience poll, and if you could answer the question, that would be great. Okay, we have around 30% of our attendees today coming from academia, 40% coming from government, 10% coming from medical practice or clinical practice, and then 20% being other. Okay. I'll turn the microphone over to Jordan, and we'll go ahead and begin.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. This is Jordan Lewis. I'm pleased to be here and want to welcome you all to this webinar this morning or this afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're in. A little bit about myself. I'm Aleut, which is Alaska Native, and I'm from the native village of Naknek in southwest Alaska. My background is social work and gerontology, and my doctoral work is in community psychology, focusing specifically on healthy aging among Alaska Native populations. The title of my presentation today, as Sarah mentioned earlier, is Gaining Entry and Working with Older Adults in Culturally Grounded and Respectful Approaches. This work is based on my experiences conducting my dissertation research and spending 3 years after my dissertation work working on various projects across Alaska, looking at issues facing our older adults in rural villages. Next slide. So just a brief outline to give you an idea of what I'll be talking about. First, I'm going to give you just a brief history of research in Alaska, what has been done and what has led to what we do today with ethics and approval process. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about community-based participatory research, or CVPR to shorten it. Then I'll talk about the tribal approval process for research in Alaska, and these are just for the communities that I've worked in. Different regions of Alaska have different approval processes in place, so be sure to find out what those are when you start your research. And then talk a little bit about what I do for strategies to work on gaining entry into tribal communities, how to get access to the important people in each community. And then, because I've been doing this work for a while, I'm going to talk a little bit about the lessons learned, talking about what I've done correctly, what I've done incorrectly, followed by some recommendations, and then finally my conclusions. Next slide. So a little bit about my background. As I mentioned, I'm Aleut, which is one of the Alaska Native groups in southwest Alaska. I grew up as a commercial fisherman in Bristol Bay. My family still fishes there every summer, and I go and visit and participate in cultural activities as much as I'm able. And I really think having a big presence of my great-grandparents in my family and visiting with our elders in the community each summer was pivotal in deciding to focus this area of research in my career, working with older adults as a social worker, and now conducting research with tribal communities to look at some of the issues facing our older adults. So I'd like to thank my family for their influence. Next slide. So this is just so in my presentation, I like to include some pictures of Alaska and some of the villages I work in, just to provide participants more of a context of what rural Alaska looks like. So this is facing south from the native village of Unalakleet up just south of Nome in northwest Alaska. Next slide. So a little bit about American Indians and Alaska Natives, so I'll just refer to them, all of them together as Native Americans. Our older adults are living longer and healthier lives, but we're also seeing them live longer with more chronic illnesses. So we may be living longer, but we might not always be living healthier. And because of this, we're requiring more extensive healthcare services and supports in a variety of different communities, from rural villages in Alaska to urban centers serving our urban Native populations. We're also still seeing a lot of our elders living in extended family environments. Raising grandchildren is pretty predominant in our villages in Alaska, living with their own children. And they're still held in high regard by family and community. So there's still this notion that elders are respected and honored, sought after for their knowledge, and become, like they call them, wisdom keepers in Alaska. And they're still honored and cared for by family and community. When I do my research in Alaska, quite often you'll have family or community members stop by, bring Native food, bring the mail, and ask the elder if there's anything they need, which keeps them independent and healthy. Next slide. So a little bit about Native American elders' history. Both American Indians and Alaska Native Hawaiians, indigenous populations globally. Many of our elders grew up in orphanages. This is predominantly our oldest population and some of the younger elders. A lot of them also went to boarding schools. My parents' generation went to boarding schools. This whole notion of kill the Indian, save the man was predominant thinking back then. So keeping them from speaking their native language, cutting their hair, disconnecting them from family for extended periods of time. And a lot of them experienced physical abuse being in the boarding schools, which has drastically changed their mental health and well-being and how they view their history. A lot of our elders were also raised by extended family or foster parents for a variety of reasons, either to be engaged in the culture, being raised by their grandparents, or because their own parents were struggling with their own health concerns and did not feel they could adequately raise their children. It also could be due to death or also relocation, so moving from a different village to an urban setting or even to just a different village. And then a lot of our elders talk about their experiences in the TB sanitariums, which were in different parts of Alaska. And these experiences also kept them away from their family, from their community, and altered how they viewed themselves as Native people. Next slide. So when we talk about working with older adults, you know, there's certain things that people have ideas about in terms of communicating with older adults, things to think about, and this can apply to doing research with older adults, being a social worker with an older adult, a healthcare professional, and there's different things that affect conversation with elders. The first one being spirituality, thinking about what's their spiritual practice, what are their beliefs. The older adults I work with, it could range from very traditional spirituality, being on the land, picking berries, to a more Western form of spirituality, attending church, prayer, making mentions of a higher power or God. Another thing that affects what you talk about with elders would be food, the kind of foods they like, A lot of elders like to talk about their favorite recipes, what the kind of foods they like. Community is also really important, talking about their community, their family. What they do to engage in their community is really important, talking about what do they enjoy, what did it used to be like in their community. Also within communities, music, dance groups are very popular in Alaska, traditional music, native music, and then how foods, goods, and services are prepared. In every community in Alaska, and even within every family, we have different ways of preparing fish, moose, caribou. You can usually tell who prepared what by how it tastes and how it's done. So asking older adults about how do you prepare your fish, or who does it the best in your community, your family, really gets them excited and gets them talking. Next slide. So some communication strategies. When I first started doing my work with older adults as a social worker in my BSW program many years ago, there was this idea that you shouldn't make contact with Indigenous older adults. I would say this depends on who you're working with. Kind of figure out, talk to the older adult, the family member, really kind of gauge the situation, because some of them appreciate eye contact, some of them might not. And if they don't, that's just how they are, and they're not comfortable with making direct eye contact right away. That's fine. Some of them start a conversation off with a handshake, and that's fine. That's happened to me a few times. Also, talking about information by word of mouth. When I go to villages and I'm either conducting a study or I'm visiting, more often than not, I get there and people know I'm there before I have a chance to introduce myself. So information passes quickly by word of mouth. Also, when you're working with older adults and you're either doing an interview, you're informally interacting in the community at basketball games, visiting with families, it's important to pay attention to nonverbal or indirect communication. Asking an elder if they're interested in doing an interview and they don't answer right away, or they make recommendations that, oh, they really want to go to the post office. They most likely won't ask you directly if you'll help them get to the post office or go with them, but these references to wanting to do something are kind of their indirect way of asking for assistance. And also listen for indirect requests. For example, I'm going to have tea with an elder during an interview, and they say, well, I wish I had more water. So this might be your cue to ask them if you can bring water in from wherever they store their water. Also, elders may withdraw. This might be a sign of disapproval. They might not answer a question you ask them. They might not initiate more conversation. So this is important to pay attention to, because you don't want to push the question or ask repeatedly, because it doesn't mean they didn't understand the question. It just means they're either not feeling comfortable to answer it right away, or they're thinking about their answer and will get back to you. And then finally, really important in Native communities that I've worked in is humor. Elders love to tell jokes. They like to laugh. This kind of breaks the ice and gets the conversation going. And sometimes they tell stories and teach lessons through humor. Next slide. So this is the native village of Koyuk. It is just southeast of Nome. It's a small village of about 225 people, Inupiat Eskimos, and I've done 3 or 4 years worth of work in this community. They have about 40 elders that live there full time. Next slide. So what is community-based participatory research, or CVPR? It's a research approach conducted as an equal partnership between community members, organizational representatives, and researchers. So when I'm doing CVPR work, I view my community partners, the elders, the family, as co-researchers. The University of Washington that I work at is also a co-researcher, and anyone that I bring onto a project is also a co-researcher, and we all work together on a project. Next slide. So I'd just like to talk briefly about some of the core principles that apply to the work that I do with villages in Alaska. and now in some of the work I'm doing with urban-based Alaska Native populations in Seattle. But one core principle of CVPR is that it's collaborative and participatory. So when I'm engaging in research with communities or individuals, I expect them to engage as much as they feel comfortable, ask for their input, seek for their guidance, and that we all participate together. And it's collaborative, it's an equal partnership, and so there's co-learning, and it's an empowering process. How I view my research is that I want to work with these communities and teach them the skills and techniques needed to do their own research, and that it should empower the community to feel like they're invested in the project, they own the data, and they have control over how it's presented. CBPR also achieves a balance between research and action. So a lot of the communities I work in, people expect to have results from the project, and they want to see something change, programs and services created, further discussions about what will they do to keep elders in their homes. So action based on the priorities of the community set at the beginning of the project. And acknowledging community as a unit of identity. This can be tricky because we get into conversations about, well, what defines community, who represents the community, who gives consent for the community. But recognizing that you might be working with a whole community as one unit of identity, which is not just one individual, but could be the whole village of 200 people. And then finally, building on strengths and resources. When I start a project, I always ask them what's working, what has worked in the past, what programs and services already exist, because I'd rather work on bolstering those resources rather than trying to bring in something new that might not work. And asking the elders and the families what works for you, because they may have answers already in the community that they haven't thought of. And it's also, CVPR is an equitable partnership. I hope they're just as much as invested in the project as I am, and that they feel like they're invested, they're getting their questions answered, and they feel that the data they're going to collect with me is valuable beyond the life of the project. And then finally, it's a co-learning process. I learn as much from my community members and my elders as hopefully as much as they learn from me, and that we're open to questions and discussions if things are unclear from both sides. Next slide. So CBPR is not really a method, it's more of an approach to research, and it works to establish relationships with tribal councils and communities willing to participate in the study. So in the work that I do, I work primarily first with the tribal councils, seek their input on a project, ask for some guidance, learn what the community priorities are, and begin the dialogue. I also work with the regional health corporations, only if the research is health related. They kind of are a larger, bigger gatekeeper in terms of working with the smaller villages in their region. And then once I've worked with the tribal councils, they kind of get an idea of what I'm interested in working on. We come up with a research question or a research priority. Then they give me permission to work with the communities to set dates to come out and do community presentations, share my ideas with the community, get their input, ask them whether or not they approve of the study and if they're interested in participating. And I have had communities say no. It's okay to let them know that just because you're there in person and you're asking questions and you want their input, you should also remind them that they do have the option of not participating. And when you're setting dates to work with tribal communities, pay attention to traditional activities. In Alaska, for example, we pay attention to the subsistence calendar. So I know that I won't get any work done in the summer because everyone's either commercial fishing or at fish camp. And I probably won't get much work done in the fall because of moose hunting. So you really have to set your schedule in collaboration with the community and the tribal council, but also paying attention to that during certain peak parts of the season, a lot of community members will not be available. And then once you get permission to work in the community and the community is approved and support your research project, Ask for permission to reach out to the elders, seek their input, get some guidance, and set up times for you to visit with them while you're in the community. Next slide. So after you get approval, what I do is I work with elders and I let the tribal council know which elders have agreed to participate, so they have an idea of which community members are in the study. The tribal council can also provide some more objective feedback on who's agreeing to participate, their role in the community, their past participation. And with approval, I locate a place where the elder's most comfortable, and we conduct in-depth interviews with the elders. And as part of the interview, I've learned that you should bring a gift. I know a lot of researchers look at gift cards, which are very popular, other tokens of appreciation. Sometimes I'll bring native food, or I'll bring smoked fish from my family as a thank you for their time, and then also providing that gift card. And throughout the interview process, ask the elders if they're comfortable. Depending on how many questions you have, break the interview up into parts. Ask half of the questions the first day. Ask if you can come back the next day or later in the week and finish the interviews. But really try to gauge the comfortable situation. Ask the elder if they're comfortable. Do they need a break? If they have any questions, do things make sense? And go from there. Next slide. So this is just a picture I took. I was driving out from Dillingham, which is our regional hub in Bristol Bay. And this is called Twin Lakes because right behind where I took this picture is an identical lake. And so we just stopped and pulled over and picked berries. Next slide. So when I'm working in communities, the first thing I like to do is determine who the gatekeepers are. These are community members, elders, and leaders with knowledge of the community. They also have a role in the community and are willing to assist with the development and execution as well as dissemination of the project. This could range from a respected elder in the community, someone that the community respects, looks up to, seeks for advice. It could be a tribal council president. It could be a younger person who's very active in tribal council, tribal government, maybe more traditional, speaking the native language, goes hunting and fishing, works with the elders. So trying to figure out who that is really important because they'll be very helpful in getting the study going, getting community input and support for the project, as well as helping you navigate the politics of working in a tribal community. And then also when I'm in the village, I try to spend a few extra days just being present, attend local events. I go to the basketball games, I'll go to sporting events, I'll visit with local elders who might not be in the study, but are just people I should get to know. So by being in the community and showing that I'm interested in getting to know the community, and that I'm not there just to gather data and leave, it's really important in building those lasting relationships and building that trust.
Jordan, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, great. I think we can go to the next slide.
Yes, please. Great, thank you. So thinking about the approval process, this will vary by every community, every region, and every tribal community outside of Alaska that you work in. So it's really important to do your research and figure out what the approval process is for each community. I was first told when I started my work that you couldn't get approval process to communities without IRB approval. In Alaska, in the work I'm doing, this is shifting in that the more relationships you have built with communities before you seek IRB approval, and you can get a letter of support from a tribal council, from the regional corporation, the more likely your IRB will be approved because they see that you have communicated with the community and the community is supportive of your project, and you're not just going to show up and propose to do this research without their input. So now through my work, I seek approval, get questions answered, make edits and changes to the project. Prior to starting the project and prior to doing my institutional review board application. So once I discuss my project with the tribal council, I get my university and my tribal review process completed. I go to each community that's been approved to be contacted to talk about the project. I solicit input on the research study, what I should be looking at, where I should be going, who I should be interviewing. And through these conversations and discussions, I might have some IRB modifications with the consent form, the demographic questions I ask, the research questions, the dissemination process. Sometimes communities change their minds and want something else disseminated, or they may decide they don't want the data shared at all. So I have to let the IRB know that the community has provided input and does not wish to have their data shared, or they would like it shared in a different format than what we originally discussed. Next slide. So after the data is collected, I do a preliminary analysis of the data with whoever I'm working with, and then I return to the community and I do a data presentation. It's a community format. I invite the whole community or anyone who's interested. Ask if I've interpreted the data correctly. Is it capturing the cultural experiences of the elders? Is it representative of the community? And then I ask them, are there any edits, changes? Am I completely off with my analysis? And what would you like the next steps to be? How should I share this with other people if you give permission for me to share it with others? And this could be in the form of a manuscript to be published, a poster presentation at a national conference. It could even be a newsletter. We did a newsletter for 5 sub-regional villages who wanted the data shared with all other 5 villages, but in a non-academic format. So we learned through these community presentations and discussions that yes, we could do a poster at a national conference, but only if we did a newsletter for their communities. And it's important that we return the results to the community, bring our findings back, ask for their input, make the recommendation edits, really get it to what they decide is most appropriate to represent them, and bring it back. And then I always provide them a final report, and I write 2 of them. I write one in very academic language with the statistics, the data. Then I write another one that any elder could pick up and understand what we learned from this study. That's very general, much shorter, but provides an overview of what we found in the whole study. And then through these conversations with the tribal council and the elders and the families, we figure out what the next steps are. Do we want to build on this study? Do we want to do a second study? Do we want to do a publication together? So having those conversations and seeking their input, again, empowers them to take control of the study and really own the data. And then even today, I still talk to communities I worked with 4 or 5 years ago. Maintaining communication beyond the life of the project is important. They want to know what kind of work I'm doing. Some communities want to know if I can come back and do further studies. So that's really important to building those relationships and strengthening that trust. Next slide. So talking about the path to healing, a lot of communities that I work with are developing efforts and projects and programs to heal past hurts, unethical research, boarding school trauma, historical trauma, abuse of many different forms. So one way to, create this path of healing is create an awareness, have these discussions, create a safe place to discuss what's happened in the past. And also acknowledge your fear. Why are people scared to talk about what hurt in the past? And acknowledging that sometimes it's okay to not want to talk about it right away, but being aware that you are not ready. Education, talking about what are other communities doing to alleviate past traumas, to heal themselves, share experiences you've had with other communities or other elders, and then accept that it's okay, and understand that this is a lifelong process and you're not going to find an instant solution through research projects, through a program or a service, that it takes time to heal a community. And then to have compassion and forgiveness for yourself. You know, boarding schools are very traumatic for some people, not everyone, but some people. Some elders suffered abuse when they were younger, or even as elders. And that to let them know this is not because of them, but because of what's happening in their communities. And through this process, they can begin to heal by creating, again, like I mentioned, the awareness and the acknowledgement and accepting it, that there is time for these discussions. And then we also, through these discussions, we need to remember and remind communities and elders and families, highlight the strengths and resources that exist, what things are going well. Too many times I think we get caught up talking about what's not going well, what the problems are, that we forget that we also have a wealth of resources in our communities that we can build on. Native people are very resilient, have a lot of strengths, and that we have supports and strengths and talents that enable us to support each other in the good and bad times, and we should also focus on those. Next slide. So this is the native village of Stebbins. It's a small community of about 125 people. That's the whole community right there. That's the airport in the foreground. A beautiful community. It has about 25 elders, and none of them speak English. So you can imagine some of the challenges with language translation, but it's also a great opportunity to get some really rich data grounded in the culture. Next slide. So just some of my lessons learned. Seems like I'm always learning new lessons every time I go out to the field or read a new article or do work. But it's really important, number one, is to listen to the needs of the community. I don't think this work would be as successful as it is if I were to read literature and find a problem that I think is important, and then go to a community and say, I think you have this problem, let's fix it. But really going out to communities, having these community presentations and asking them, what are your priorities? What does the community want to address together on something of importance, health or non-health related? I've also learned I have to work in a flexible or iterative process. A prime example is the IRB. Some projects I have 4 levels of IRBs to go through. You can imagine if one has an edit to make, I have to go back to the beginning and resubmit everything. Or communities have changes. Tribal council members will change. Tribal council presidents will change. Some of them may be aware you're doing research, some may not. So being aware that you might have to reintroduce the study, get new approvals, and go back out. And that this work cannot be rushed. Sometimes I get this pressure, being at an academic institution to get projects done, get publications, get the next grant. But if work is really to be done properly and these relationships are meant to be strengthened and fostered, it can't be rushed. And then similarly, local culture and knowledge must be respected and integrated. Again, I don't think this research would be as successful if it wasn't reflective of the communities and I didn't have their input. Because when I write publications and grants, I really want the story of the communities to be at the front and not my interpretation of what I think is happening. And then number 4, establishing trusting relationships is crucial. And this is because we take time to get to know the community, get to know the elders, ask questions, provide opportunities for them to ask us questions. And then this research must respect and reinforce sovereignty and self-determination. So again, empowering communities to own the project, own the data, and have a voice in what's happening and how they're represented when you're done with the project. Next slide. So 6, take the time to be patient, build relationships, and spend time in the communities. Like I mentioned, going to basketball games, being present there, not as a researcher, but as a visiting community member is really important. This lets them know that you're invested in the community as a whole and not just to collect your data and be gone. incorporating their culture. Sometimes I get requests from other researchers or my colleagues who say, well, you're Alaska Native. What do you think? What would your background and training and your experiences in the village say about this project? Well, I have my own interpretation based on what I've experienced in Alaska. I really want their culture, knowledge, and values and experiences to be reflected in the project. Tribal councils and gatekeepers are key to a successful project. I don't think I would be well received in the village if I just showed up and started interviewing people. So getting to know who those key people are, building relationships with them, and creating that trust between the two of you that you are there to do good work and you respect the community. And then finally, do not be afraid to make mistakes or say or do the wrong thing. A graduate student and I have a paper that published by the Journal of Indigenous Research really that highlights what we've done wrong through CVPR. And what we've learned from that, though. You know, we shouldn't be afraid to make mistakes or say the wrong thing, but learn from those experiences and improve your practice in the future. Next slide. So the most important lessons research with tribal communities is about building, maintaining, and respecting relationships. This is very important, and I feel that if you build these strong, respectful relationships, your work with those communities will go on for years beyond the life of the project. And then second, using a CVPR approach builds trust and lasting relationships with elders and communities. So not only are you building relationships with communities as a whole, you're building relationships with the families that live there, the elders, as well as the future elders that are growing into the elder stage. Next slide. This is the primary mode of transportation for the work I do. Of course, this is in the winter. Same planes are used in the summer. But all the villages I work in are off the road system, are not accessible other than air or boat in the summer or snow machine in the winter. So this is how I get around when I do my field work. Next slide. So some recommendations, and these are just recommendations based on the experiences I've had. Other researchers I know that work in Alaska or with tribal communities have similar or different recommendations. But first of all, just to ensure tribal communities are supportive of invested in the project, because a project will not go very far if you don't have the support or interest of the community as a whole. And you want to ensure that everyone in the community, the tribal council, the elders, the family, feel that they're contributing to the project in all phases. So starting at the very beginning from designing the research question, implementing and doing the actual study, and then disseminating the findings. You want to ensure they feel like they've had some kind of say in how that's all conducted, and answering questions if they have any. Develop relationships with communities. The 2 regions I work in Alaska, I still check in. I let them know what I'm currently working on. I seek their input on projects. I also just ask them, what are your priorities? What are you seeing that's happening in villages across Alaska that I might want to be aware of as a researcher? And then really important is keeping your promises. If you say you're going to do a study and you're going to be there right after fall hunting, they'll expect you right after fall hunting. They'll be ready for you to come out. They'll have the community ready. Communities are really invested and interested in someone doing good work with them. So make sure you keep your promises, and if you can't, let them know and follow up and let them know why and reschedule. And then finally, it's your responsibility to ensure the community is respected and protected. This involves asking them when you're doing a public presentation or a presentation or a publication, how they want to be addressed in the publication. Some communities I work in want the name of the village listed. Some communities do not. They just want to be known by the region where they live. So making sure you know those small things like that, because it would be detrimental to your trusting relationship that you've built if you publish something or present something and you label a community and they had not wanted that to happen. They might not trust you for a while after that. Next slide. Also important is really getting to know the tribal councils in the communities you're working in. Some tribal councils have high turnover rate, some do not. So getting to know who works there, who's been well respected in the community that's been involved with the tribal council, keeping them up to date on what you're working on, what your next steps are, what your thoughts are about future projects, and always ask for their input, ideas, and advice, as well as any changes they would like to see. Am I interviewing the right people? You might ask them, I'm kind of low on numbers for interviews, who would you recommend I get in touch with? And they can help make those connections also. And then a quote that kind of summarizes this kind of work is that programs work best if they are both culturally relevant and developed with major community or local input. Next slide. So more recommendations is you work with these communities and tribal councils until they are comfortable with the project. This could range from just one meeting to 6 months to a year. Some tribal councils and communities are really kind of hesitant about research still, so they might not agree right away to participate in your study. They might have a lot of questions, and I'm open to questions. I encourage them to ask questions because, again, that's a way of demonstrating they have an idea of what they want to have done, what they want to not have done, and also empowers them to own the process. As I mentioned earlier, you want to include local knowledge, cultural values, and experiences when you're designing and implementing the study. This is really important because I've learned through experience that just because you're working in one Yupik village across the river from another Yupik village, they might have different cultural practices, their language dialect may be different, they may prepare fish differently. So if I just make the assumption they're the same and go across to the next village, barriers come up, and then we have to address the differences, and it might add more time to your project. And a way to work with that is to work with a local bilingual speaker. Again, in the previous example, two Yupik villages across from each other might have a different Yupik dialect. So translating your documents, you'll have to take time to do that. And translating the consent forms, the interviews. And I really like to hire someone local who knows the local dialect, knows the community, and that can also serve as your gatekeeper. And then finally, it's important to have a broad range of community collaborators. In my research, I established elder advisory councils. I put together a group of people and communities to guide me on the project. This can include elders, native leaders, and community members. Next slide. This is the same community as before. This is the summer. And if you look across the picture, straight across the water would be Russia. Next slide. So in conclusion, CVPR with tribal communities in Alaska is a very rewarding process or approach to research. It can be very time consuming, it can get frustrating at times, but also the end result is worth all the effort you put into it throughout the project. As a result of doing research through this approach, I have lasting relationships with elders and communities. We've come to trust and respect each other. They're not afraid to tell me what I'm doing wrong or what I could do differently. And I'm not afraid to ask for their input and guidance when I feel lost. And then now communities reach out to us to conduct new projects. I'm being asked by regions to do different studies because they appreciate the approach to research I use and know that I'll keep their best interests at heart when I'm doing the research. And then finally, findings would not be reflective of the elders and the communities if they weren't involved. I think, the work I do, I really want the stories of the elders and the communities to take precedent and be the forefront of a study. And if I collect the data without having any context or understanding of the community or the process, their culture, their language, it would just be data and it wouldn't be a story or the experiences of those who are involved. Next slide. CBPR also empowers communities and individuals to take an active role in research, and it also teaches them to do their own research. My eventual goal in life is to teach enough villages across Alaska how to conduct their basic research studies that I don't need to visit them anymore. They can collect their own data for grant applications, to do their own research, to have a voice in what they're doing. And CBPR also results in addressing the community's priorities. Communities like to do research that's meaningful for them, that addresses a concern or something they've been wanting to work on for a while. It also gives them ownership and voice in the process. So it's not just me showing up, a top-down approach to research where I say, well, here's what I'm going to do. You've addressed a concern. I'm going to do the research. I'll let you know what I find. Rather, it's let's come to an agreement on what we want to study, and I'm going to work collaboratively with you on the skills and what you need to do the study, seeking your input along the way and coming to conclusions together. Next slide. I'd like to thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for that wonderful presentation. This is Sarah Yanke, and I have a few words to say before we end, and we will also have a Q&A session, so please, attendees, don't go anywhere yet. So on behalf of the Gerontological Society of America and the Indigenous Peoples and Aging Special Interest Group, Dr. Jordan Lewis and I thank you very much for your participation today. Also, thank you to the Mentoring Effect, a special project of the GSA Innovation Fund, for providing support for this program. And also a reminder that you will have access to a link after this after this webinar is completed, and it might take a little time to be posted, but it will be posted, and you can download the link and review the webinar at your own convenience. Also, there's going to be a downloaded copy of the presentation slides and recommendations report from the website listed at the bottom of the screen. And before we move on to the Q&A session, please know there's also a webinar that will automatically be launched after this presentation is over. So we would love to hear your thoughts. And again, you can provide feedback by clicking the survey link at the end of the webinar. So on to the next slide. And so we will have our Q&A session. Just a reminder that you can type and send questions using the questions feature in the dashboard, which is accessible on the right-hand side of your screen. We will not be using the raise hand feature today. So if you have a question, please be sure to use the panel. Dr. Jordan Lewis and I will do our best to answer as many questions as possible, time permitting, during the last part of this webinar. So it's 12:16 right now, and we have around 14 minutes to answer some questions, and we're just waiting here to get our questions to us. And some of you might be typing, so we'll just wait a few minutes for any questions to be asked.
Hi, Sarah and Dr. Jordan Lewis. This is Judy Liu from GSA. I have a question that is coming up on my screen here. The question is, you have some immediate entree due to your native status. Can outsiders do this kind of work, or is it necessary for someone to have insider status?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. That's a great question. I think using this approach to research enables anyone who's interested in working with communities to do research. I failed to mention when I did my dissertation research, I was an insider to the region I worked in, but I was an outsider to the villages. So despite the fact that I was Alaska Native from the same region of Alaska and knew a lot of people in the villages, it still took me 1.5 years to get approval and support and input from communities to do my research. But I would say if you're going into the community and you want to do this kind of research and you approach it in this respectful and meaningful way, I don't think it matters what your background is or where you're from, what you're studying, because communities will see you're vested and you're interested and you have their best interests at heart. That they'll work with you, they'll develop the relationships, they'll help you develop a research study that's meaningful for everyone involved. But that's a great question, thank you.
Dr. Jordan Lewis, this is Judy, and I've got another question popping up. What happens if the elder community representatives interpret the results differently than the researcher?
Another great question. That has happened to me before. What I do is we have a conversation about what they see in the data, what I see in the data. This is also commonly happens when I work with my colleagues who don't work in villages and I'm interpreting data from an urban setting. Because we come from different backgrounds, we have different lenses that we view our data through. There's always going to be differences, but when I'm working with older adults or an elder person in the village or a tribal council, I primarily go with their interpretation because, again, it's their data, it's their experiences. Unless they're completely way off with how they're interpreting the data and it would make no sense to anybody else, I'll work with them, have that conversation, ask them, am I way off? How is my data different? We'll come to an agreement somehow and either talk about both perspectives or meld them together. And if I don't feel it's really reflective of what I saw in other interviews, I might ask somebody else in the community, take the same interpretation the elder gave me and ask another elder, ask a tribal council member and say, this is one interpretation I got. I don't divulge the name of the person who gave the interpretation. Ask for a second opinion and have those discussions. This also happens when I give community presentations. The whole community, when I did my dissertation work, I presented my findings. Very nervous about it because if the community disagreed with my interpretation of the data, I'd have to rewrite the whole dissertation. But we had those conversations about this is what I see, this is what the community provided, and engaging in these conversations and being upfront that there may be differences in how you view the data. Communities are really willing to work with you and come to a conclusion that meets the needs for both parties.
Excellent. And I have one more question, Dr. Lewis, if you don't mind. It's a little similar to the first, but asking for a bit more. Do you find there are additional challenges for non-Native American researchers gaining access to this population, and what would they be and how to work past them?
That's a great question, too. I appreciate asking that question. Some of the additional challenges might come from past experiences of research with specific communities. Not every community feels empowered enough or confident enough to want to engage in research with anybody. So depending on who you work with, some outside researchers might have challenges of gaining entry, finding the gatekeeper, getting a community involved. You might get that invite to come to a community and meet with the tribal council president, but then the communication stops after that. This is where you have to pay attention to those indirect or nonverbal communication. Like if you're not re-invited back, you're not asked to follow up or expand on your project, kind of a good indication that they might not be interested at that time. And that could be for a variety of reasons. It shouldn't be internalized. It's not because you're a bad person or they don't like your research. They may have had a past experience with the researchers that's been very negative. Some communities are very isolated. They're very geographically isolated. So it might, I've heard some colleagues when I was doing my dissertation work that were required to spend a year in a village before they even got approval to start a study, because the community really wanted them to get to know the community, get to know the culture, the language, the history. That student's dissertation was much more rich in data and context. So that might be a barrier, because if you're a researcher, if you're a student, and you're trying to graduate within a certain number of years, and then a community says, yes, you can work with us, but we want you to spend a whole year doing nothing but being in the community, might be a big barrier for someone who's trying to graduate school. Other barriers might be language, accessibility. Some communities, some of the villages I work in are very protective of their elders and their youth. So if you're proposing a project with those vulnerable populations, there might be a lot of red flags or barriers to the community. So they might say no. Again, that's not because they don't approve of who you are as a person or your research, but because they probably have very good valid reasons for not approving research right away. And it's okay to ask. Ask them, you know, can I come back later? Can we reapproach this question? You know, I've done research on alcohol use in tribal communities. That's a big red flag right there. A lot of villages don't want to know their elders are drinking. So working with the villages, knowing that that's not okay with them, asking how can we reframe this question for future research. But I think tribal communities are getting much better about having outsiders coming in to do research if they have the community's interest at heart. Being very transparent about your process, letting them know, you know, you want to work to get together in a collaborative partnership on this project, and letting them know that you're not just there to gather data and leave. And that's only demonstrated through actually doing it. So it's really hard sometimes to say, yes, I'm going to do a CVPR approach to research. Just trust me, I'm going to do it. It's through those small things of spending time in the community, knowing the gatekeepers. But I think, you know, even for other Native researchers, I have a lot of challenges trying to get access to the urban-based population in Seattle. I want to work with Alaska Natives who are here. You'd think it might be easier because I'm an Alaska Native, but it's not. So I think no matter who you are, what your training is, or your background, there'll always be some kind of barrier or challenge.
Do we have any more questions, Judy?
No, that was a lovely answer to that last question. It kind of covered some two that came in, and actually I do have one more here. Do you find that many tribal-specific community data is not readily available? What is the best way to obtain background data on specific tribal communities prior to visiting the community to ensure you are in line with their culture and customs?
That's a great question. I get asked that quite often, or I'll do a presentation at a conference on some of the data I've collected, and people are like, oh, we had no idea you were doing that kind of work, or where can we get access to the products that came out of that project? The best way to get localized data from a tribal community is just to ask the community themselves, or find out who the lead authors are on a publication that resulted of that data. I know here at the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute, we have a warehouse of data that we've collected over the years from all the studies here that you can get access to once you sign an agreement form, and the data is clean, so it's confidential. It's also very challenging to get access to tribal data because, one, tribal communities might be very protective of the data, or they might not know where it is. They might have lost contact with the researchers. So I would start with asking the tribal community if they have copies of the data, where they might get it, any background information. Of course, there's the, if you're doing health research, there's the Indian Health Service is another good spot to start asking for information. There's the National Indian Council on Aging in Albuquerque. They have a database. There's the University of North Dakota Center for Rural Health, has an American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian Evaluation Center. and they've almost evaluated every tribal community in America. So that's another good database of information. The challenge with knowing where tribal data is also all our support services, our government agencies, our tribal organizations are all very fragmented. So you might have some data here, you might have some data there. There's not one big clearinghouse or warehouse where all the data is stored. There's also the urban centers. There's the Urban Indian Health Institute here in Seattle that houses all the urban data for Native Americans in the country. So, sometimes I just reach out to the tribal community. I'll do a Google search. I'll start with the Indian Health Service. I'll start with the regional headquarters for the Indian Health Service and find out where data might be collected there also. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay, I think we're at time now. It's 12:30, and this webinar was 1 hour in length. So I just want to conclude by thanking everyone for participating in this webinar. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, and also thank you, Judy. And this is the end of our program, and do not forget to complete the webinar evaluation so we can get continual improvement on how we can improve the webinars in the future. So without further ado, we will go ahead and end this webinar. Thank you very much. Take care, you guys.